I was cut off a little bit on that last section, but again, an acclimation is a change, an adjustment in response to some environmental change, like think of a change in temperature, summer to winter, for example. But the acclimation, the change is reversible. So it's not a permanent change. You acclimate to a environmental situation. So among vertebrates, so things with backbones, like you, an endothermic animal is one that maintains its normal body temperature. Sometimes they're called warm-blooded. Birds and mammals can generally tolerate temperature extremes. If you think of the animals that live at the South Pole, penguins, right? Those guys are birds, and they're endothermic, and they can handle those extreme temperatures because they maintain a fairly constant body temperature. However, ectotherms, so the therm refers to energy or heat. Endo means within. So we maintain our body heat by our metabolic processes within our bodies. Ectotherms is like the opposite. Ecto is external, outside of. Therm is energy or heat. So the ectothermic animals, or the ectotherms, obtain heat from the environment or lose heat to the environment. So the ectotherms, their body temperatures tend to kind of fluctuate with the environmental temperature. The endotherms, our body temperatures tend to stay fairly constant, even if the environmental temperatures change. So because of things like that, ectotherms, like reptiles, mollusks, slugs, insects, can tend to tolerate more limited ranges of temperatures. So you're never going to find a slug at the South Pole because it can't handle those temperature extremes. So ectotherms are also called cold-blooded organisms. Okay? These are the appropriate terms, endotherm and ectotherm. So continuing with acclimation. So for example, mammals can grow heavier heavier fur coats in the winter and then shed them in the summer. And if you have a dog, you know that their dogs shed a lot, or cats, in the spring and the summer when they lose that heavier coat. But then they put on that coat in the winter. Some mammals also put on extra blubber, fat, for preparation for winter, and they slim down for the summer. Think of like the hibernating bears, for example. So again, these are temporary changes. So these are acclimations. And in some animals, fur or feather color also changes seasonally. So the winter fox, right? It's a predator year-round. So in the winter, its fur coat gets white to help it blend in, camouflage. In the summer, it gets back to its normal darker coloration. Again, it's acclimating to environmental changes. Sessile plants, meaning they can't move around. Like birds are motile, for example, they can move. But plants are sessile, so they are stuck where they are. So they have to rely on other processes, anatomical changes in their body shape or form, or physiological changes, responses to survive environmental fluctuations or conditions. So some trees, like this tree is an example of a tree that lives in a very cold, windy environment. And it looks wind-blown because it's responded to its windy environment, like sacrificing, losing some branches on the windy side, but still being able to survive. And then, by the way, these types of trees, what are called evergreens or conifers, they tend to do better in really cold environments compared to the broadleaf trees, like the trees that lose their leaves during the winter. And we'll talk more about that in this chapter. Okay? But again, plants, they have anatomical and physiological responses to survive fluctuations like temperature. So let's look at behavioral responses to environmental changes. So for example, animals can respond to changes in the environment by moving. We mentioned migration already. Or moving locally. An ectotherm, remember something that's cold-blooded, can maintain a fairly constant body temperature by moving between the sunny spot and the shady spot. Lizards and snakes, reptiles, they tend to sun themselves in the morning or find a place where they can absorb some environmental heat. And then once they're up to optimal body temperature, then they become very agile, at least the ones that are fast, and then go about their day. If you've ever gone snake hunting or lizard hunting, hopefully catch and release okay. The best time to catch these things is early in the morning when their body temperature is still pretty cold. They're slow, sluggish, and they're much easier to catch. Sometimes in the early evening, you can find snakes or even lizards out on the road, on the asphalt, because the asphalt's dark and they're absorbing some of that environmental heat. So migratory birds can travel great distances. They can go from like Canada all the way down to South America, some of them, in response to seasonal changes. So these are behavioral responses. Okay, let's move on to a big theme, biomes. So what's a biome? It's a major territorial or aquatic life zone characterized by particular types of vegetation and or animal life and or the physical environment, particularly in aquatic biomes. So freshwater is characterized by non-salty water environment, and marine or saltwater environments are characterized by salty water, like the oceans. But it doesn't take long for you to see a picture of something and recognize it as, oh, that's a desert or a grassland. Why? Because abundant grasses, all right? So we're going to look at different biomes on the planet and do a lot of generalizations because there's exceptions in biology to like everything. Okay, so aquatic biomes occupy about 75% of the Earth's surface, right? It's a blue planet in the sense that there's water everywhere. And the biomes are determined by their salinity, right? Saltwater or freshwater, think of lakes or rivers. And then other physical factors as well, as we will get into when we get into specific aquatic biomes. But the aquatic biomes on their planet are the largest in the sense of they're covering the bulk of the planet's surface. Freshwater biomes, those are lakes, streams, rivers, and wetlands. And as we'll see, they're actually a really small biome. Most of the water on the planet is saline or saltwater. And marine biomes include the oceans, intertidal zones. If you've ever been tide pooling, you're in the intertidal zone. That's the boundary between land and ocean. And then the super abundant and diverse, abundant life and very diverse coral reefs, which tend to be in shallow waters and in the warmer oceans. So let's move on to freshwater biomes. So the biomes, freshwater biomes, they're actually really small. They only cover about, at most, 1% of the Earth's surface. And they only hold, look at this, 0.01%. That's about 1/100th of a percent of the Earth's water. Most of the Earth's water, right, like 99% of the Earth's water is in the oceans or in the polar ice caps. And the freshwater biomes, they do hold about 6% of the known species on planet Earth. So even though they're relatively small, they are very important. Use of freshwater biomes by humans, drinking water. That's where we get our water, either from reservoirs or pumping it up from ground reservoirs, wells, that's freshwater. Irrigating our crops. Sanitation, think about flushing the toilet. And then industry uses freshwater quite a bit as well. So freshwater is used and unfortunately abused by humans quite a bit. So freshwater biomes fall into two basic groups. The standing water, lakes and ponds, where the water really doesn't move around much. And then the flowing water, rivers and streams, where the water moves sometimes very rapidly, and it's often an area of change. Think of erosion and those sorts of things. So let's move on to lakes and ponds. So these are standing bodies of water that range from small ponds to huge lakes like North America's Great Lakes. And in lakes and large ponds, there's communities of plants. There's aquatic plants that can grow in or on the water surface. algae, remember the photosynthetic protists, whether they're small or large, and animals that are distributed according to the depth of the water and distance from shore. And we'll look at these zones as we get more into our aquatic environments. So the photic zone, photic for photo. So this is the area, the layer of the aquatic environment that photosynthesis is possible because it's at the surface. So your photosynthetic organisms are going to be in the photic zone. The aphotic zone, just like abiotic, anti-photosynthesis, antiphotic zone, that's the deeper waters where light levels are too low for photosynthesis. So a shallow pond is going to be completely the photic zone. But if you think of a deeper lake, maybe say Lake Tahoe, once you get below the photic zone, then you get down into the aphotic zone. No photosynthesis there. There's still life. There's fishes and such. And they can go up and down in the water column. So the benthic zone, benthic meaning bottom, it's the bottom of the aquatic biomes. And it's occupied by many communities of organisms depending on the depth. So there's algae and aquatic plants and worms and insect larvae and mollusks, clams and such. In the shallower photic zone, the benthic realm of the photic zone, microorganisms, and you tend to get a transition to only microorganisms as you get deeper into the benthic realm of the aphotic zone. And again, there's more abundant life in the photic zone, again, because photosynthesis can occur there. You have producers and then consumers that are going to take advantage of those producers in the shallower benthic realm of the photic zone. So phytoplankton, if you remember these things, these are the things that float around. Planktonic means you're floating around in the water. And phyto means they're photosynthetic. So these are the algae and the cyanobacteria. These photosynthetic, small, sometimes microscopic members of the producers in the aquatic realm. And they are found up in the photic zone. Right? Don't worry about the terminology here in this particular figure. The amount of phytoplankton is often regulated by the amount of nutrients, in particular nitrogen and phosphorus. Where nitrogen and phosphorus are a little bit limited, the water tends to be nice and clear. Where you see green, murky water in a lake or a pond, it's usually because there's abundant nitrogen and or phosphorus, and you can get a phytoplankton bloom, which can actually be detrimental because oxygen content can drop, and that's harmful for larger organisms like crayfish and fish and those sorts of things. So usually the healthier the lake or the pond, the clearer the water. The murkier the water, in terms of especially green algae and phytoplankton, usually the more unhealthy the habitat. Again, those are generalizations. Okay, let's move on to rivers and streams. So rivers and streams, flowing water, dynamic environments. There's erosion, there's silt, there's movement. So that makes a different challenge for the organisms that live there. So these are bodies of flowing water that support different communities of organisms versus lakes and ponds. In a way, it's almost easier to live in a still water than it is to live in moving water. But there's definitely organisms that have adapted to the turbulent environment of a lake and of a stream or a river. So they do change in their composition, rivers and streams, from their sources upstream, up in the mountains, for example, to the point where they empty into a lake or out into the ocean. Temperature changes, usually from colder to warmer. The flow changes, usually from faster to slower. Again, I'm talking from source to outlet. Nutrients usually change from fewer to more. And the same with the sediment. Usually there's less sediment upstream. Again, generalizations, and there's more sediment as we get towards the end of a river or a stream. So they have been affected a lot by pollution and dams to control flooding. Most rivers in the United States are actually dammed for producing drinking water, regulating floods, and for producing hydroelectric power. In some states more than others.